Everyone. Welcome to online lecture number 2. And this continues to be a weird situation talking to the computer, and I apologize at the outset for any noises, but they should have stopped the construction because I believe they can't work past 6, and it's now past 6. So today we're going to talk about, we're going to finish talking about the labeling approach and get through conflict theories, and we're going to stop before feminist theories. So you will not be tested on sex or gender in feminist theories, and we'll pick up on that after test 1. And I'll also note that I'm going to split this up into a couple of videos because it took quite a long time to upload, more than 2.5 hours, the last one, and I was worried the whole time that it was going to be messed up and I'd have to start over. So I'm not doing that again. So to pick up on the labeling theory approach, the central tenet of the labeling approach is straightforward. Deviance and social control always involve processes of social definition. So Howard Becker's comments which are now widely taken to be the most important point or statement of this position, were that social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infractions constitute deviance, and by applying these rules to particular people and labeling them as outsiders. This was initially a bit of a controversial statement, which is curious given the importance granted to processes of social definition in sociological work, represented, for example, by W.I. Thomas's famous statement that, quote, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And this statement's basically a truism among sociologists. So it was really surprising that Becker's comments were greeted by a lot of fuss when originally stated, but now they're super famous and have been quoted ad nauseum, really. But the key idea is a constructionist one. Deviance is not inherent in the act itself, but is constructed in social interaction. So at the heart of the labeling approach is an emphasis on process. Deviance is not viewed as a static entity, but rather as a continuously shaped and reshaped outcome of dynamic processes of social interaction. It's this general theme of process in the construction of deviant roles and the development of deviant self-conceptions, and in the use of such concepts as career and deviant commitment, that one can see the indebtedness of this approach to the theoretical perspective of symbolic interactionism, which I discussed on Monday and was initially articulated by George Herbert Mead. So I mentioned aspects of symbolic interactionism, but I'll repeat a few. So Mead saw the self as inherently social, as a reflexive process that is central to social interaction. So for Mead, human action could not be viewed simply as a product of determining factors operating on the individual. Rather, quote, the human being is seen as an active organism in his own right, facing, dealing with, and acting towards the objects he indicates. So from this view, social patterns are believed to reflect a continuous process of fitting developmental lines of conduct to one another. And we talked about some examples on Monday. A major implication of this approach was noted by Norman Denzin in reference to interaction as constituting an emergent quality that may not have existed before the parties came together. And so the key idea here is that interaction produces social outcomes that are more than simply the sum of the parts. Instead, new things are created and recreated and responded to in interaction. And this process is central to symbolic interactionism in the labeling approach. So as a constructionist perspective, it's a central tenet of the labeling approach that neither acts nor individuals are deviant in the sense of immutable objective reality without reference to processes of social definition. So if we've discussed almost every conceivable dimension of human behavior is considered conventional or deviant from the normative perspective of some existing group. And the one exception to this general rule is incest, which is almost everywhere, if not everywhere, considered to be deviant. So in saying that deviance is created through processes of social definition, no one is arguing that the behavior that we call homicide or theft would not occur if it was not defined as deviant. Rather, the argument is that it's meaningless to try to understand and explain such deviations without taking into account the fact that in a given social order, they are inevitably defined and reacted to in various specific ways. So such reaction processes affect both the nature, the distribution, the social meaning, and the implications of the behavior, whatever other factors may help to account for the initial occurrence of the act of deviation by individuals or groups. So social action, as Weber emphasized, is not merely externally observable objective behavior. Attached to it is a highly significant component of subjective meaning, which is shared among individuals in a culture or group. So appreciation of subjective meaning is, and for that matter, even patterns of deviations across social groups, is impossible without attention to processes of definition and labeling. And so hopefully now you're like, quit repeating this already. So, as an example, the meaning and consequences of theft are not the same for a boy who's undiscovered from one who is caught. The meaning and consequences of an adulterous relationship change when it becomes disclosed to a community. Similarly, a false accusation of wrongdoing can have very serious consequences for an individual, regardless of the fact they have not ever committed the act, right? So definitions and labelings can have significant, symbolic and real effects, not that symbolic effects aren't real, regardless of the underlying acts or inactions. So the important point is that all behavior takes its meaning from definitional processes in which it is enmeshed, in which they are enmeshed. So comprehensive understanding of any course of deviating action thus always requires appreciation of the definitional context, including labeling processes that relate to informal and formal punishments and reactions. So juvenile delinquency is one area that the labeling process has been widely applied and has really informed research and public policies. Indeed, the juvenile justice system itself was created in part because of a concern about the negative impact of being labeled and treated as a criminal and how that would have an effect on a young person in his or her life. So this is reflected in both the terminology and treatment of offenders. Offenders are, quote, adjudicated delinquents rather than, crime, convicts. So delinquents do not have to later check the box on, job applications or whatnot that ask about convictions. And in many states, juvenile records may be sealed or expunged so individuals can have a clean slate as an adult. And one of the initial and best research studies of labeling theory was conducted by William Chambliss, and it was called The Saints and the Roughnecks. And this really powerfully illustrated the power of labels in social reputation in response to acts that were very similar. And so what Chambliss did was he hung out, in which he engaged in an observation of two groups of high school boys. One, the working class boys known as the Roughnecks, and the middle class Saints. And they were from the same community, which he called Hannibal, to not, as a pseudonym. And this was before, Hannibal Lecter, so it seemed like a normal name. And what he did was he found that actually both groups were engaged in similar amounts of delinquency, but their behaviors elicited different social and community responses. So the Saints, who were the upper middle class boys, were well-dressed, well-mannered, drove nice cars, and were given the benefit of the doubt. They were seen as boys being boys, and they were often just given lenient treatment by people in school, community members, and even the police. The Roughnecks were viewed as troublemakers, as delinquents. They were often in trouble with teachers and the police, and again, even though they engaged in similar patterns and amounts of delinquency. So the question he asked and really tried to explore, theoretically, is why did they get treated differently, and how did this differential treatment affect their life courses? And he found that it profoundly shaped the courses of life for these two groups. So he also asked, why did the community, the school, and the police react to the Saints as though they were good and had bright futures, and react to the Roughnecks differently? And how did the Saints maintain a positive image given that they were constantly engaged in delinquent behaviors? And he noted the Saints were never arrested during his observation period, while all of the Roughnecks were arrested at least once, and some were arrested numerous times. So an example he gave was about the Saints' driving. He said, when sober, they were bad drivers. When drunk, they were horrendous. And the Saints often drove around drunk the community on weekdays and on weekends. And the Roughnecks, in contrast, they would often get drunk, but they had to engage in behaviors in areas in proximity to the school and the community and the police because they didn't have cars and didn't have the ability to get transported elsewhere. So he also said that the Saints' behavior was often more dangerous for the community, whether it was their drunk driving. He also talked about one particularly dangerous prank that illustrated their behavior, where they would remove warnings about road construction on the edge of a particularly dangerous curve on the road and, hide behind the bushes outside of the view of the people on the road and watch the cars go by and struggle to successfully make it through that dangerous curve without the warnings about the road construction, which, as Chambliss noted, it was only a very lucky situation that no one actually died as a result of this. So why the different treatments? And he said it's not explainable with reference to the frequency or serious of deviant acts. The Roughnecks engaged, they fought, but usually with each other. The Saints tend to get drunk, drive around town drunk, and pull pranks that had a greater potential to actually harm the community. So first was visibility. The Roughnecks' behavior was more visible than the Saints. And he said this was a direct function of their lower status. Their lack of a car, their inability to obtain liquor, and their inability to basically manipulate legitimate excuses from school. So he said since the Roughnecks had less money and teachers carefully supervised their activities because they expected them to be bad, they basically wanted to drink and skip school as much as the Saints, but they were unable to, and they were punished for it much more often. The Saints, for example, often he talked about would work together as a team and move around the school and get each other excused from classes, which were just lies to skip school. So he said that they would go around and seen as good, well-behaved boys, they would be taken. The words would be taken, they would go say, Mr. Griffith, Andrew is needed to help with a chemistry experiment. Could you please excuse him from class? And then Andrew would go ask someone else to be excused from class. And, by 11:30, they had all been excused and they spent the rest of the day. They drove outside of the town and they would hang out at a bar where they were allowed to drink underage and be truant and get drunk. And no one was aware of their bad behaviors. Whereas the Roughnecks would get in trouble for trying to skip school. They would then have to try to, pay someone who was over 21 to buy liquor for them, and they would end up just kind of drinking liquor on the curb outside of the liquor store where they were easily viewable by the police and others. And so he said visibility was a huge factor. In addition, demeanor was a big factor. If one of the Saints was caught by a policeman, by a school teacher, by a community member, even if he felt he was truly innocent of the wrongdoing, he didn't feel he was innocent. Chambliss suggested that he was very contrite, apologetic, and penitent. He said a Roughneck's behavior was almost the polar opposite. When confronted with a threatening adult authority, even one who tried to be pleasant, he said the Roughneck's hostility and disdain were clearly observable. So he said the Roughnecks would sometimes attempt to put up a veneer of respect, but it was thin and usually not accepted. So given that they were often viewed as hostile, the police, the teachers were more inclined to punish them and punish them harshly for their misbehavior. And whereas the Saints were able to manipulate authority and feign compliance and feign contrition in ways that often allowed them to be excused. He also said perceptual bias, and this is often largely related in the class structure of American society and the control of legal institutions by those at the top of the class structure. So he said as a function of labels and social reputation, Saints pranks and behaviors were seen as sowing wild oats, boys being boys, whereas the Roughnecks' behavior was seen as serious and indicative of future trouble. So, obviously, no one, he said, simply just, drew up an operational chart for the police and, told them to look in the ghettos and the street corners and on the curbside for the boys. But that is often where police look for misbehavior. Viewing the lower class boys as troublesome and likely, to be engaged in serious delinquency, they focused on their behavior as being bad and then, surveilled their behavior more seriously and respond to it in kind. And so, whereas the upper middle class kids were often warned, excused, and when they were caught for doing serious things, for example, driving horrendously while drunk, instead of arresting them, the policeman would call their parents. And, their parents would cooperate and get them excused. Or in some cases, the parent would, in one or two times, he observed that the parents would, suggest that they would be giving the police trouble if they didn't excuse their son's, temporary poor behavior, and they would get them off that way. And finally, reinforcement of the labels. So they said the community responded to the Roughnecks as boys in trouble, and the boys agreed with their perception. Their pattern of deviancy was reinforced, and breaking away from it became increasingly unlikely. Once the boys acquired an image of themselves as deviants, they selected new friends who affirmed that self-image. As that self-conception became more firmly entrenched, they also became willing to try new and more extreme deviances. With their growing alienation came freer expression of disrespect and hostility for representatives of the legitimate society. This disrespect increased the community's negativism, perpetuating the entire process of commitment to deviance, whereas the reverse was true for the Saints. Now, the key part here again is the behavior was similar. It was the response and the role of labels and the class structure that shaped everything. Now, this selective perception had really strong influences on these boys' lives. So 7 of the 8 members of the Saints went on to college immediately after high school. 5 of the Saints graduated from college in 4 years. The 6th one finished college after 2 years in the Army. And the 7th spent 4 years in the Air Force before returning to college and getting a BA. Of those 7 graduates, 3 went on for advanced degrees. 1 finished law school and is now active in state politics. 1 finished medical school and is practicing near the town of Hannibal. And 1 is working for a PhD, or was at the time of the book. Whereas the other graduates served as managerial or executive training positions within larger firms, usually accorded respect. All were accorded respect within the community. On the other hand, the Roughnecks had a really rough life. Many of them were, all of them were arrested at the time. Many of them continued to get seriously arrested throughout their life course. None went to college. 3 were in prison for long prison terms at the time that Chambliss's book were written, and 2 had been involved in murder cases, with at least 1 having been the actual person who was charged and convicted of killing someone else. And the key point here is that because of their position in the community and because of the labels attached to them and the way we respond to labels, regardless of behavior that was similar, this is just a powerful illustration of the function of labels and the process of behavior. And the fact that if anything, the Saints were involved in more serious delinquency really just underscores the labeling point that behavior itself and differences in behavior is not what underlies differences in treatment from schools, community members in the criminal justice system. But once the differential treatment is reinforced and labeled, then it begins to take on a life of its own. And so that is, it's a really actually fascinating book, and while it hasn't really been picked up in as much detail among scholars in current day society, all evidence suggests that the same processes are still holding true, where boys that are lower class who don't have the labels of being, boys who are just sowing their wild oats tend to, on occasion get on the school to prison pipeline, whereas those who were upper class are excused, ignored, and were treated very leniency. And those differential treatments profoundly affect life chances and life outcomes. So Braithwaite it took on the role of labeling in conflict theory and developed a theory on crime, shame, and reintegration. And this theory is important for several reasons. One, in illustrating the difference between stigmatizing and reintegrative shaming, and the other for setting up a new way of treating people in the criminal justice system. And Braithwaite was Australian, and some of his work has been implicated in, or some of his suggestions have been adopted in Australian society, less so here. So according to Braithwaite, high rates of predatory crime in a society are indicative of a failure to shame those acts labeled as criminal. So Braithwaite argues that the breakdown of community ties in modern urban communities, and he wrote this in 1989, has meant that perpetrators of crime are not made to feel ashamed of their actions, and thus they continue victimizing others without remorse. So those who are more integrated into the community and involved in relationships with others are less likely to commit crime because they appreciate the shame and embarrassment that would result from violating community norms and values. Now, the concept of shame is the linchpin of this theory. So Braithwaite suggests that if perpetrators were made to feel guilty about their actions, they would be deterred from committing further crime. He bases this assumption on the belief that those who are closely tied to family and community anticipate a negative reaction to the violation of community norms. So if you are attached to your parents, or you're attached to your teachers, you anticipate what they'll think of your behavior before you do it. So foreseeing the shame that they would feel, people are deterred from committing crime who are closely tied to family and community. However, according to this theory, shaming must be done in such a way as to be reintegrative, bringing the offender back into the community rather than disintegrative, which would push the individual even farther out of the community. And he would argue that, for example, the Roughnecks received disintegrative shaming. So for Braithwaite, reintegrative shaming is the key to effective deterrence and crime prevention. So shame that is stigmatizing or disintegrative occurs when both the act and the actor are denounced as unworthy of the community. So there are no efforts to reintegrate the offender, and he or she is just rejected by the community. Disintegrative shaming is exemplified in our traditional criminal justice system and the courts and the sentencing processes. So the offender is stigmatized by their conviction and literally as well as symbolically sent away from the community to prison and get a label which is affixed to them for life. So rather than stigmatizing the act, people are stigmatized as criminal people. They are labeled as bad people, not people who committed a bad act, and they are shunned from the community, which breaks any feeble community and family ties that may have been there in the first place. So for Braithwaite, shame that is reintegrative is the ultimate deterrence against the violation of social norms. And so the idea is you have a stake in conformity. So reintegrative shaming is characterized by a ceremony in which the criminal act committed is denounced and the community members express their disapproval of that act. The shaming ceremony is then followed by efforts to reintegrate the offender back into the community of law-abiding or respectable citizens through words or gestures of forgiveness or ceremonies to decertify the offender as deviant. And the emphasis here is that the act is shamed, not the offender, and then the offender is ceremoniously reintegrated back into society. An example of this can be found in New Zealand family group conferencing, which is frequently used to deal with cases of juvenile delinquency. So in this strategy, the victim and offender meet in the presence of family and community members to work out an appropriate restitution and a consequence for the crime, and then they are reintegrated back in and accepted as full-fledged members of society. And in Canada, a similar process of circle sentencing, which they call it, is sometimes used by Aboriginal communities. So this is the opposite of what we do here, which is, shame the offender, send them off to prison, and then, feebly reintroduce them back to society with a bus ticket and a criminal label, which basically makes it difficult and in some cases impossible to reestablish ties to community. So the idea, again, that shaming that's reintegrative is not soft or easy. It's not about being lenient. Instead, it's about being done with, firmness, but also love and caring. So the idea is that the difference between reintegrative and disintegrative shaming is not in the quality of shaming, but its aim and the processes that follow from it. So disintegrative shaming emphasizes the evil of the actor. It casts the persons out, while reintegrative shaming acknowledges that the evil act is a bad thing, and even the society comes together to shame the act, while then coming together to reintegrate the person who is not inherently evil. And the reintegrative shaming is often followed by gestures of reconciliation and inclusion, and the idea is before deviance is established as a master status, which is a master status is one that is generally observable about others in society, and that follows a person around, powerfully influencing their lifestyles and life chances. So, thinking back to labeling theory approach, drawing on American symbolic interactionism, labeling theorists argued that efforts to punish or treat those involved in crime and delinquency were often more likely to increase rather than decrease subsequent illegal conduct by stigmatizing them as delinquents or criminals and by altering their self-concepts. So the public policy message that labeling theory suggested was, the less you do, the better. So this policy recommendation meshed perfectly with the rejection on the part of labeling theorists on the notion that crime itself was pathological or morally wrong. So instead it was considered no less meaningful or authentic than any other form of human activity. David Matzo was a prominent labeling theorist, even encouraged us to appreciate deviance as a form of human diversity rather than viewing it as something to be eradicated. And this obviously was, a form of radical cultural relativism, and it did have instantaneous appeal for students and professors who were active in the civil rights and anti-war movements, or were sympathetic to the hedonistic counterculture that approved drug use and less restrictive sexual mores at the time. They certainly did not consider themselves pathological for engaging in those behaviors. So, some have said that they were preoccupied with, university deans who meddled in students' private lives and their private lives, and maybe their private lives, which involved sleeping with students, and police officers trying to stop marijuana use and LSD use. Students and professors found the labeling theory approach to be appealing, and the idea that deviants were not inherently bad, but were victims of moralistic busybodies or repressive bureaucracies that were, just annoying. But obviously, this theory is more applicable to certain acts of deviance than others, right? So to say that some acts aren't inherently bad and that the less we do, the better, is obviously not the right way to go about things for acts of homicide or rape or robbery and things like that. Now, that doesn't imply that the more we do, the better, only that what Braithwaite discussed, we could be doing some other things better. So the labeling theorist's approach can be understood as potentially very applicable to more victimless types of crimes, and differentially applicable to those that are more serious. So, the theme that dominated much in this work was the contention that criminal legislation was determined not by moral consensus or the common interests of the entire society, but by the relative power of groups determined to use the criminal law to advance their own special interests or impose their moral preferences on others. So at a time when the decriminalization of marijuana and abortion were being debated and the rest of civil rights workers made daily headlines, this position did make a good deal of sense. Now, labeling theorists, it doesn't hold a lot of sway in today's criminology or study of deviance in terms of being widely adopted to shape criminal justice outcomes or policy interventions. In the delinquent realm, it is more applicable, and it does hold sway there. But in terms of what its impact was for criminology and the sociology of deviance, it was the labeling theorist's introduction of the concept of power as being important to understanding deviance and the construction of deviance. So labeling theorists introduced the notion of conflict to the study of deviance, and that itself was, that alone was an important breakthrough. So here is a multiple choice question that you're not going to have to know because I skipped over this slide. But in case you wondered, according to labeling theorists, labeling can lead to secondary deviation really in three key ways. By encouraging involvement in a deviant subculture, and we saw this with the Roughnecks a little bit, but the idea is that by labeling someone as deviant, we encourage them to join a deviant subculture and become part of that group. Actually, might as well ask this question since I'm saying it now. In addition, by altering individual self-concepts. So the idea, it's very clear that others label individuals as deviants, they then adopt that self-label, and they begin to see themselves as deviant and act in ways that reaffirm that label. So the idea is that labels are a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by labeling someone as deviant or criminal, you're only going to increase their criminality through such self-fulfilling processes. In addition, by limiting opportunities, whether it's by the label of a criminal that makes it more difficult for people to get into college or get housing or get employment, the idea is that labeling limits life chances, and we saw that clearly with the Roughnecks' behaviors. So according to labeling theorists, labeling can lead to secondary deviation, and secondary deviation is deviation that isn't the initial act that's labeled. Secondary deviation is deviation that follows from the initial act of labeling and is essentially caused by the act of labeling. So the answer obviously is 4 or D for all of the above reasons.